Welcome back to Institute of Psychotherapy, Legacy and Constellation of Francesca Toscayes. So we are going to kick off the first panel of the day, titled Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole, Psychiatric Hospital, a Laboratory of Political Resistance. And we'll hear from Camille Ropsis, Eric Fassin, Jean Khalfa, Robert Jung, and the program is moderated by Lewis Gordon. Thank you all for being here. It's exciting to have you all on the screen. This first panel of the day charts the story of the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in southern France, where Toscayes reshaped institutions of therapeutic care from 1940 to the early 1960s after being exiled to France during the Spanish Civil War. A quick reminder that closed captioning is available by activating the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And again, there will be a time for Q&A at the end of the panel. So please share your question in the chat room and we will answer them at the end of the session. And now I'll hand it over to Lewis Gordon, who will be introducing and moderating the panel. Lewis R. Gordon is Board of Trustees, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Global Affairs and Head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. He is also Honorary President of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and Distinguished Scholar at the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies, MONA, and the chairperson of the Awards Committee at the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Thank you so much, Lewis, for being with us today. And now, please welcome Lewis Gordon and our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matilda. Also, for everybody, just briefly, the kalimba. I just thought I would do a little musical evoking of the ancestors. So, well, it's bon après-midi, peut-être bonjour ici. Here, where you are, of course, is bonsoir. Bonjour to some. Hotep Shalom, Assalamu Alaikum, Jiwich to our Irish brothers and sisters, and Buenas noches in Spain, and Buenos dias here. Thank you so much. It's also, I enjoyed so much listening to the keynote discussion. There's so many ways it's rather interesting to be speaking about not only such an interesting person, but an interesting person who lived in such interesting times. Boy, and it's now befallen upon us to discuss not only him, but the events around him in our interesting times. It's funny also hearing his name. It's remarkable, from Toscayes to Tosquel to Tosqueles for some. It's a remarkable feature of his generosity that he didn't correct people in his name, but actually accommodated the different ways in which his name was pronounced. In a way that's it's not only a model of generosity, but it's also a sign of something rather complex in terms of how he dealt with his work as a therapist, as an activist, as a political person who thinks about institutions. However, we're not here for me to reflect on him, but from the stellar community of interesting individuals who are also dealing with their interesting times. So without further ado, first thing I'd like to say is that for those who are just signing on, this is panel one, Saint-Alban-sur-Limagnole, Psychiatric Hospital, a Laboratory of Political Resistance in question mark. Additionally, the way we'll proceed, because if I went through everybody's biography in once, we won't get directly to the sessions. So what I'll do instead is talk more about each person's biography before they speak, okay? So first up, we have Camille Ropsis, okay? And Camille I could say Camille for a variety of reasons, but among them, actually for many people in the panel, these are not only people whom I know in a variety of other contexts, but I think I know in the best way, which is I use their work. You see, there are people who always say all kinds of kind things about people, but they don't cite them, they don't engage them, etc. But these are people who have produced what we call necessary work. Well, Camille Robsas is professor of French and history at Columbia University. She specializes in modern European history with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, France, and intellectual, cultural, and legal history. She's the author of Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis in the Family in France from Cornell University Press in 2013, and of Desalination. I'm sorry, because I started a little in French, I said it a different way, but if I use the English, Desalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, University of Chicago Press 2021, which I should add is one of this year's winners of the Frantz Fanon Outstanding Book Award by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. So, felicitations, right? Or as the ancient Kemetan or Egyptian people say, dua neter, but basically, brava. Okay, she's currently working on a new project tentatively titled The War on Gender. I know of a person called Judith Butler who would love a conversation on that issue. Okay, she has received fellowships from the Penn Humanities Forum, LAPA, Princeton Law and Public Affairs, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. So without further ado, we'll have Camille Robsas, who is going to speak to us on the political and psychiatric formation of Tuskegee. Camille, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Louis, for such a generous introduction. So let me share my screen. Does this work? Yeah, okay, good. So thank you so much to Louis for this introduction, to the organizers, especially to Mathilde and to Valérie for including me in this conversation. It's been really, I've been working on Tuskegee for many years, and it's, I think everybody in this room are kind of fellow travelers in this project, and it's been really interesting to see how this exhibit has moved from different countries, and it's for me particularly exciting to see it in New York. And so what I was tasked to do today is to provide a little bit a kind of window into not so much into Saint-Alban, but into Tuskegee in his early life, and to talk about his political and psychiatric formation, basically his youth before he arrived to Saint-Alban. And so I want to make two arguments today. The first one is that Tuskegee played a really key role in the dialogue between psychiatry and psychoanalysis. And the second thing I want to suggest is that Tuskegee's psychiatric work was fundamentally shaped by his activism in radical politics in Catalonia and by his experience during the Spanish Civil War, first as a doctor for the Republican Army and later as a refugee in a French concentration camp. So all of the episodes convinced Tuskegee of the intimate link between the political and psychic oppression, between political and psychic freedom. For him, politics and psychiatry needed to work together to disalienate subjects. And Marx and Freud were complementary figures, the two sides of one same struggle that he called a politics for madness. So he has a very famous idea that this idea of a double alienation, right? That one is not just alienated because of social circumstances, but also because of psychic events. And so that you had to disalienate on both sides. And the two legs, the idea is that when one leg walked, the other followed. So this is another famous quote from Tuskegee that he said, from age 10, I already knew what I wanted to do, bring Freud to the asylum and bring psychoanalysis to the patients. Later, I understood that without Marx, a psychiatrist is nothing. Marx talks about the problems of man as a social being, and Freud talks about the psychopathology of man, why he is condemned to suffer. Without them, we cannot understand anything about man, let alone about the mad. This is what all of these biological psychiatrists refuse to understand when they think they can cure the world with a pill. So, so that's kind of the broad outline of what I want to talk about. The first part is called Marx and Freud in Catalonia. So this is, again, just a little bit of background. This will be familiar to many of you, for the people who perhaps don't know Tosquelles as well. Tosquelles was born in Reus in 1912, south of Barcelona. Throughout his youth, he was deeply marked by the Catalan political and cultural effervescence of the turn of the century. Catalonia became one of the first regions of Spain to proclaim itself a republic in 1931 after the victory of the ERC, the Republican left of Catalonia, which favored socialism and Catalan independence. In 1936, at the dawn of the Civil War, the ERC joined other parties in the formation of a Spanish Popular Front against the fascist forces of France, led by Francisco Franco. The 5 years that the ERC was in power were especially vibrant for the labor movement in Catalonia. This was a movement that was marked by a strong anarchist and syndicalist currents. The CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, founded in Barcelona in 1910, anchored itself on the neighborhood-based sociability and reciprocity networks that had emerged in the last decades of the 19th century. Significant philosophical and tactical disagreements divided the myriad of workers' collectives during these years, but many on the left bonded over their disillusionment with the official Spanish Communist Party, the PCE, which they perceived as much too subservient to Moscow and much too eager to accept integration and centralization. Instead, the CNT and many of these other groups on the radical left advocated federalism, decentralization, worker solidarity, self-management, and consciousness raising, particularly through culture. So this is the time, for example, where they're building a lot of libraries, organizing worker concerts, and trying to basically get workers to politicize through this means. In 1935, several of these activists founded the PUM. The PUM's advocacy of federalism, regionalism, and anti-authoritarianism clashed with the Soviet directives for socialist movement throughout Europe and Stalin's foreign policy, which had become increasingly obsessed with the notion of sabotage and treachery, especially after the successive defeats of the 1920s. As the PUM's leaders reiterated, Stalin's Comintern was a perfect example of ideological colonialism, and Tosquelles called it a grotesque attempt to impose the map of Russia onto that of Spain. Tosquelles joined the PUM when he was a student, so when he was in his 20s, very young, and throughout his life, he reasserted its foundational role in his life and in his work. Specifically, Tosquelles liked to repeat that his activism in the PUM taught him to refuse the all power, in French, le tout pouvoir. And what he means by this is the ways in which politics, so a politics, for example, like Marxism and Stalinism, had a tendency to become authoritarian, reified, stagnant. As Tosquelles saw it, decentralization, self-management, and solidarity were the necessary mechanisms to avoid the establishment of this tout pouvoir, and this not only within the confines of the psychiatric hospital, but really throughout society at large. In parallel to his political activism, Tosquelles attended medical school. He chose to specialize in psychiatry, which was a booming field in the Catalonia of the early 20th century. Psychiatric reform was central to the Catalanist political project during these years. And one historian, Josep Comelles, has talked about this as a moment of Catalan psychiatric nationalism. And this was really premised on this idea that the individual subjectivity and social communities were conceptually analogous, and thus that psychiatric care needed to be adapted to the Catalan regional specificity. Between 1911 and 1925, one of the government's main structural initiatives was to decentralize psychiatric care through the implementation of these district divisions that were known as comarcas. The idea behind these comarcas was to allow patients who did not require hospitalization to continue living with their families in their usual surroundings. And in many ways, the comarca system laid the foundations for what would later be called in France psychiatrie de secteur, which Joanna referred to in her talk, a movement that Tosquelles and his associates first developed at Saint-Alban and that was eventually adopted by the French Ministry of Health and generalized to the rest of the territory in 1960. Among the most important actors in this Catalan psychiatric reform movement of the early 20th century was Tosquelles' mentor, Emili Miray Lopez. Like Tosquelles, Miray was actively involved in leftist politics. He was also a doctor who practiced psychiatry at the Institut Pere Mata in Reus. Tosquelles was already well acquainted with the Pere Mata clinic through his uncle, who was also a doctor there, and he joined the medical team soon after finishing medical school. Miray was a prolific writer, and he held the first chair of psychiatry at the University of Barcelona in 1933. He was also one of the main popularizers of Freud's thought in Catalonia. He was an avid reader of phenomenology, surrealism, psychoanalysis, and he incorporated all of these insights into his teaching, his writing, and his medical practice. As Tosquelles recalled, it was Miray during their clinical briefings at the Pere Mata who taught him to question the idea of a kind of detached and objective psychiatrist, which was really the positivist ideal throughout the 19th century. And he encouraged him instead to consider the doctor's own transferential relationship with the patient and with the hospital. It was also through Miray that Tosquelles first encountered the work of Jacques Lacan, who remained a constant source of inspiration throughout his life. To deepen his understanding of psychoanalysis, Tosquelles began an analysis of his own in 1933 with Sándor Ayménder, a Hungarian Jewish doctor originally from Vienna, who was one of the many Eastern European exiles who had landed in Barcelona. At the time, Barcelona was often described as a small Vienna throughout the 1930s. So there was a kind of very active psychoanalytic community there. In particular, Tosquelles and Miray together read Lacan's early work, especially his 1932 thesis titled On Paranoid Psychosis and its Relation to the Personality. The thesis revolved around the case study of Aimé, a 38-year-old railroad clerk who had inexplicably tried to kill a famous actress in Paris. As Lacan put it, the goal of his analysis was not just to deepen the description of Aimé's illness, but to bring to light its very conception. In other words, what Lacan really wanted to do through this case study was to understand her paranoid delusions and to kind of come up with a theory of psychosis rather than just a kind of description of it. Aimé had all kinds of delusions, including the idea that the actress wanted to harm her child, that she would write to the Prince of Wales, with who she claimed to be in love with. So Lacan's question when he had Aimé in his clinic was to understand whether paranoid psychosis, in other words, madness, originated in the brain, as many neuropsychiatrists or neuroscientists believed, whether it was an organic disease, or whether it was actually shaped by the social and familial worlds of the patients. Lacan's answer was clear, and I'm quoting him here. He says, "It is absurd to attribute these phenomena to a specifically neurological automatism." So the word automatism here, I think, is really important because Lacan's point is that instead of focusing on a single origin, psychosis needed to be studied in relation to the formation of what he called a personality. This meant that psychiatric clinical work needed to remain open to sociological inquiry, to medical examination, but most importantly, to psychoanalytic treatment. Indeed, psychoanalysis was, according to Lacan, the only discipline able to provide a coherent theory of subjectivity. And here we can think about basically Freud's idea that the subject emerges through conscious and unconscious representations of others, right? And starting with your parents all the way to kind of a social world. So the social was always involved in subject formation in Freudian psychoanalysis and also in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan's thesis was revolutionary in at least two ways. Within the field of psychiatry, which was still largely focused on brainization, so trying to find in the brain the cause of schizophrenia or of paranoia. But it was also revolutionary in the field of psychoanalysis because Freud had studied psychosis kind of most thoroughly in his 1911 case of Daniel Paul Schreber. And after, he didn't actually have Schreber as a patient, but he used his memoirs as the basis of his analysis. And after writing that book, Freud was not exactly convinced that his talking cure that he had invented, psychoanalysis, he had invented it for neurosis. He wasn't sure that it would work for psychotic patients who had a radically different relationship to language, to transference, and to the symbolic. This goes back to what Carlos was talking about in terms of the transfert éclaté, that the transference for psychotic patients is much more social as opposed to intersubjective like it is for neurotics. We can return to this if you'd like later. The second, so war psychiatry. In July of 1936, a few months after the election of a left-wing Popular Front government, which included the POUM, a group of army officers led by the General Francisco Franco staged a military coup that marked the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. Mirat joined the resistance movement along with Tosquelles, and Mirat became an advisor to the Republican Army. From this position, he recommended that Tosquelles be appointed head of the military psychiatric service and sent to the Southern Front. The Catalan government plan to decentralize mental health care through the Comarca system was obviously interrupted by the war, but Mirat believed that it could still be carried out within the structure of the army. Tosquelles, who possessed a thorough knowledge of Catalan health policies and who was committed to this new modern and reformed psychiatry, seemed like an ideal candidate to carry this mission through. And it was in this context that Tosquelles set up his first therapeutic communities in the middle of the war. In the front, in Almodóvar del Campo, where he started to test many of the theories and practices that he would later develop at Saint-Alban. And more specifically, he started to realize that it was really important to treat not just the patients individually, but the community as a whole, the commandants, the whole institution in which these soldiers were inscribed. In July of 1939, Barcelona fell to Franco's army, and in March of that year, the fascist final victory put a tragic end to the Spanish Republic and to the Civil War. In the months that followed, Tosquelles, like many other Republicans, fled Spain and crossed the Pyrenees into France as part of the massive exodus that came to be known as the Retirada. Like many other Spanish refugees, Tosquelles was placed in a camp, the Camp de Jude, in the town of Ceffonds in southwest France. Now, the French government was actually had followed the Spanish War very closely and had said that they would welcome the Spanish refugees, but in fact, for complicated reasons that had to do with a kind of rise of the right and of xenophobia in France during the interwar years, they decided to instead put these refugees who were mostly on the left in these concentration camps. This is the camp that Tosquelles was in, called the Camp de Ceffonds. Living conditions in the camp were especially harsh. Many died of hunger, disease, or exhaustion. Others were driven to suicide. The refugees were amassed in overcrowded barracks surrounded by barbed wire, electrical projectors, and surveillance posts. They slept in haystacks with only little wood available for heat and in deplorable hygienic and sanitary conditions. Many of the testimonies from Ceffonds also recall the brutal treatment from the guards and the system of surveillance and classification to which the refugees were subjected. As many reports suggested, the camp looked and felt more than anything like a prison. As he recalled in various interviews, Tosquelles was deeply marked by his experience at Ceffonds and what he described as the concentrationist or carceral environment. Tosquelles, when he arrived actually at when he was at the camp, he also said that the camp reminded him of a badly organized psychiatric hospitals. So this kind of metaphors between camp, prison, and hospital were kind of became interchangeable terms for many of the people who thought the basis of institutional psychotherapy. Worried by the rampant psychic disarray in the camp and by the growing number of suicides, the camp director welcomed the arrival of Tosquelles and allowed him to set up a psychiatric service within the camp. So again, Joanna already mentioned this, that this is his seal from the infirmary. And Ceffonds had the reputation of being one of the most intellectual camps, since many of its prisoners happened to be political activists, artists, and musicians. Tosquelles thus relied on these prisoners to help him organize activities such as concerts, art, theater productions, publications, but also group therapies, all of which he was hoping would temper the effects of this camp psychosis. This is another famous quote by Tosquelles. He says there was only one psychiatric nurse, the rest were normal people. I think this is one of the places where I conducted very good psychiatry in this concentration camp in the mud. News of Tosquelles' work in the camp and in the front traveled in medical circles and eventually came to the attention of the director of the Saint-Alban Hospital, Paul Volvet. Thus, in 1940, Tosquelles arrived at Saint-Alban. And so he arrives, you notice the date, 1939, but he arrives early 1940 in the middle of yet another form of concentrationism and another form of occupation, the German occupation of France, the Vichy regime, and the humanitarian disaster that was occurring in French psychiatric hospitals. So this is the slide. So this is a picture of the hospital when Tosquelles arrives, and this is some of the books that have traced the death of the 40,000 patients in French psychiatric hospitals. There's a kind of historiographical debate about whether this was done because of a kind of exterminationist policy or because it was just done because of lack of care. But the point is that they died mostly due to the cold, food shortage, and lack of care. What Max Lafon has called soft extermination. So when Tosquelles gets to Saint-Alban, the first priority is to hoard enough food to feed the population with the help of the local villagers, but also to encourage the patients to work in the fields and produce their own meats and vegetables. The second priority is to continue to operate as a hospital without attracting the attention of the German or of the Vichy authorities. This experience of surviving a war was a major catalyst for the genesis of institutional psychotherapy. The war was crucial in convincing Tosquelles and his colleagues of the need to radically rethink the practical and theoretical basis of psychiatry so as to not to be complicit with the biopolitical assault on the mentally ill. But it was also, in some ways, the war and fascism that brought together to Saint-Alban the particular cast of characters who eventually put in place the basis of institutional psychotherapy. And these included Lucien Bonafé, the psychiatrist and resistant, who was very involved with kind of resistance movements at the time, the historian historian of science, Georges Canguilhem, who had been thinking about the relationship between the normal and the pathological. That was his thesis and eventually his book, which again were very important, provided a very important source, a theoretical source for the development of institutional psychotherapy. Georges de Maison, Marius Bonnet, and Paul Éluard, who again Joanna already mentioned, amongst others. Saint-Alban during the war became a center of citation and intellectual effervescence, but also of political resistance against Vichy and against fascism. As Bonafé recalled during this period, the occupation produced an experience of fraternity which was essential at Saint-Alban. Or as Bonafé put it in another interview, the practice that developed at Saint-Alban needed to be understood as the coming together of two conjunctures, one medical and one political. It was the product of so I'm quoting Bonafé here, it was the product of the radicality in the resistance to the inhumanity of the psychiatric world and the result of the resistance to the Nazi occupation and collaboration. According to Bonafé, both Éluard and Canguilhem played a key role in this, what he called a philosophy of the no, this imperative of rupture that eventually led to psychiatric reform. So the goal of psychiatric reform was never to provide a kind of to offer a kind of model of psychic and political resistance. It was to offer a model of psychic and political resistance, but not a kind of rigid template that could be applied indiscriminately anywhere. In the words of Jean Houry, and I just want to conclude with this quote because I think it really captures the spirit of what they tried to do at Saint-Alban. The goal of institutional psychotherapy was the act of setting up all kinds of mechanisms to fight every day against that which can turn the whole collective towards a concentrationist or segregationist structure. So I think, again, if you look at Tosquelles' life and you see how he came up with these ideas of concentrationism and segregationist structure, his trajectory through the POUM, through the concentration camp, can shed a light onto this. There was no reason. There's no reason why Marxism had to turn into this kind of authoritarian politics. Similarly, the camp didn't have to become this horrible space. So why is it that institutions have this potential, and what can we set up within the confines of the hospital, but also within society at large? How can we set up mechanisms to prevent this from happening. And as I said, their goal was not to kind of offer a grid or a model, but more an ethics, a way of thinking and living. Their goal was to, in the words of Tosquelles, really an attempt to cure life. So that's where I will end. Thank you so much.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next speaker, and we'll have discussion after the presentations, is Eric Fassin. Eric Fassin is a professor of sociology and gender studies at Paris 8 or Paris 8 University, affiliated with the research center Sophia Paul at Paris Nanterre, and a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. He works on gender, sexuality, race, and immigration as democratic issues. In 2021, he co-edited with Salima Amari, Femme en rupture de ban, unpublished interviews with two Algerian women in France by Abdelmalik Saïd for Raison d'Agir, and with Caroline Ibou, a collective ebook entitled Défense et illustration de liberté académique, and that's published by Mediapart. He just published State, Anti-Intellectualism and the Policy of Gender and Race, A Liberal France and Beyond, by CEU Press Budapest, and with Joanna Massoy, Elsa von Freytag, Lorraine Roven, the artista que dio cuerpo a la vanguardia. That's by Arcadia in Barcelona in 2024, and the forthcoming La Savante et le Politique, for the Sciences Sociales Critiques with Caroline Ibou, Flammarion, Paris. Fassin will speak right now on war and amok. The screen, as we say, is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, but also thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with scholars whose work I appreciate. And finally, thank you, Louis, for this, for chairing this panel in a very generous way for all of us. Let me talk about war. And of course, this resonates with our present, but I will start with Tosquelles. There's a phrase that was used by Tosquelles when he was in the civil war in Spain, which was quite astonishing. He said, "One might say that for us, war is a kind of paradise." This was 1938. And it's not something that he said once. He said something comparable, similar, about the Sept-Fonds internment camp that he was in 1939, the following year. When he talked about it, he said, "I have never done such good psychiatry as concentration camp." This is obviously very paradoxical, but he explained this later when he said that there was an analogy to be found between the dynamic of these civil wars and what happens within each of the patients we take care of. That is, the argument that Tosquelles made is that the civil war has a kind of truth about society. He said, in practice, during these great collective catastrophic upheavals, there's in fact a decrease in the number of psychoses recognized as such. So this bizarre paradoxical nostalgia for war, which he expressed repeatedly, was because in fact war makes explicit what is otherwise implicit, that is the violence of social relations. He said, when a family stays together, it is because its members are continually at war with one another. So we understand things in this context of war that otherwise we would not understand. Another phrase, another sentence that he used was, "What is proper to man is war." Let me underline that this is not the usual thing to say about war. And in particular, the contrast with Fanon is interesting. Frantz Fanon stayed at Saint-Alban in 1952, when he arrived, just after publishing his book, Black Skin, White Masks. In that book, Fanon was criticizing the complacent culturalism of psychoanalyst Octave Manoni, who talked of a so-called dependency complex. So he was very hostile to this, as Césaire had been. In fact, he analyzed, again, some of the dreams that had been discussed by Manoni when Manoni was talking about Madagascar. And he said, you know, it's these furious black bulls that people dream about. They have something to do with the Senegalese soldiers who were sent to massacre the people from Madagascar in 1947. So don't look for metaphors. The enraged black bull is not the phallus, and the rifle of the Senegalese soldier is not a penis. It's a genuine rifle, model Lebel 1916. So in fact, the argument by Fanon is that if you want to understand the unconscious, you have to look at the times in which the dreams take place. And so the context for the study of Manoni, which was left out of the book, was the fact that 80,000 natives were killed. That is to say, Fanon adds, 1 of every 50 persons in the population. He went back to this later in Algeria, when Fanon was there and as a psychiatrist, and in his publication, in his final publication, The Wretched of the Earth, where there's a passage on colonial war and mental disorders. There are examples of how war affects people. For example, impotence in an Algerian man following the rape of his wife. Or you have a European inspector who starting all particular bringing up his wife and his children, and his torturing. And so, of course, what happens in war has consequences on the psyche. For example, Fanon talks about the murder by 2 13 and 14-year-old Algerians of their European playmate, and they're asked why he was your friend. And they respond, well, has any Frenchman been arrested for all those Algerians that were killed? And people tell him, but that's no reason for killing your friend. Well, I killed him. This is a kind of madness that is very different from what Tosquelles is talking about. And Fanon actually insists on something that gives the title to my talk, the phenomenon of amok. Individuals that go crazy, that lose any control. They go down a street unarmed or just with a knife, and they start screaming, "Long live independent Algeria, we've won." And of course, it ends with a burst of machine gun bullets. The man is usually killed. And running amok is explained by Fanon as a kind of signal of impotence. Political impotence, military impotence, in the context of domination, of colonial domination. Fanon mentions the case of a young Algerian man who's busy with his studies and who's not involved in the anti-colonial struggle, but who soon becomes racked by guilt and begins to hear voices. Traitor, coward, all your brothers are dying. And so finally, he walked over toward the soldiers, hurled himself onto one of them, and tried to grab his machine gun, shouting, "I am an Algerian." So, as Fanon demonstrates very well, war drives one mad. That's, again, very different from Toscaeus, because there's continuity between the normal and the abnormal in the work of Toscaeus. So let's go to a third example, that of Georges Devreux. Georges Devreux, who developed ethnopsychoanalysis, wrote a text, famous text, called Normal and Abnormal. And in this text, he discusses amok, so the cultural origin. But what is more interesting is that he says, in situations of stress, culture itself provides the individual with a kind of instruction manual for abuse. That is, society is telling the individual, don't do it. But if you do, this is how you should do it. That is, this is how you should go mad. So one does not go mad in just any way. Even insanity, Devreux argues, conforms to social conventions. And this has to do for him with the fact that, of course, madness is social. But it is social in a way that, how can you adapt to a society that is not normal? In a mad society, how can you not go mad? He takes the example, and this is a man who was a Hungarian Jew, took refuge in France in the 1930s, in the US, and published in 1956, that is at the time of the Budapest uprising against Soviet repression. So he says, in April 1945, the German psychiatrists asked over on the day his patient joined the Nazi Party. But in May 1945, so a month later, his work was over the day his patient joined the Christian Democratic Party, if he lived in Frankfurt am Main, or the Communist Party, if he lived in Frankfurt am Oder. So societies are sick, and there's no way we can adapt without going mad. So amok, for him, is just the symptom of these contradictions. Now let me go back to Toscaeus to see how we can fit these different characters in the same picture. What Toscaeus says is that you have to involve, and this is work that has been examined very carefully by Joanna Mazeaud in her book. Let's involve amateurs. Let's involve ordinary people in the psychiatric hospital. Lawyers, country priests, madmen, peasants, etc. Including, he says, whores. That's his word. Why? Because you don't want too many psychiatrists, because the professional deformation of psychiatrists is that they tend to draw a line between normal people and madmen, whereas other people are not so scared of madmen. And so why are whores, to use again Toscaeus' term, why are they superb nurses according to Toscaeus? Because they know full well from their experiences with men that everyone's mad. So in Saint-Alban, people can easily pass off as mad. That's the way it's an asylum, that is a refuge for not just madmen, but also foreigners, Jews, political refugees, etc. That's why you have so many people who go there. But conversely, if normal people can pass themselves off as mad, what you have to see is that mad people have to be careful, and they have to pretend they're not mad. In particular, when they go outside of the hospital, because it could be dangerous for them. He told patients in the 1930s in Catalonia, hallucinate and be as delirious as you like when we're in here, but learn not to act crazy outside with your family, with the police, etc. Now, to conclude, I want to talk about the present. And when I say the present, I'm thinking again about amok. and the forms of terrorism that have spread since 2001 that are often perpetrated by isolated individuals. And courts have had a hard time deciding whether people were mad or not. Let me take the example of the Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik. There was a big discussion to know whether he was mad or not because he was talking about weird things like Eurabia, etc. And then people realized that this is what the far right is talking about. So they said, no, he's not mad. So either you're mad or you're political. Well, maybe it's not either or. There was the example of a man in France, Kobili Traoré, who murdered his neighbor, Sarah Halimi, in 2017, and he shouted, Allahu Akbar. And so there was a big discussion, and eventually he was judged criminally irresponsible. So he was hospitalized. But at the same time, anti-Semitism was acknowledged as an aggravating factor. The question is quite simple. Why couldn't one be both psychotic and anti-Semitic? That is basically, politics is not something that exists outside of madness, and madness does not exist outside of politics. We could quote Deleuze and Guattari in their Anti-Oedipus in 1972, which was fueled by the experience of institutional psychotherapy at La Borde. And I quote, the unconscious isn't delirious about mommy and daddy, but about races, continents, history, and geography. So the mad are sick with society, but war is the truth of the world. What's the difference between what Tosquelles is saying and Fanon? Well, Fanon is talking about colonial wars. Tosquelles is talking about civil war. And so the question about colonial wars, and this is what Fanon insists on, is that when you're looking at what happened in Algeria, people at the time didn't talk about the Algerian war. They talked about the events of Algeria. So there was a mock corresponded to this unstable in-between state in which a society hesitates between war and peace, between naked violence and the denial of violence. And this twilight uncertainty, when the world itself does not know exactly whether it is at war or not, whether it is telling the truth of its violence or lying to itself, is the condition for a mock. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was superb. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to have discussions after the next presentation, but as I could say with Camille and you, we're off to a wonderful start, and I'm already, the wheels are proverbially turning. So we move now to Jean Kalfa and Robert J.C. Young. I always just say Robert and Jean, but Jean Kalfa is professor in French studies at Trinity College, Cambridge, in the UK. And he specializes in the history of philosophy, modern literature, aesthetics, and anthropology. He has published many studies of Frantz Fanon thought and co-published with Robert J.C. Young an edition of Fanon's collected, previously unpublished because they're not published, literary, psychiatric, and political writings, available in English as Alienation and Freedom, published in 2018. Should let you know I taught an entire seminar on that volume. He's currently working on books on Wilfredo Lam's Artists, Books, and Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Le Dernier de la Terre. Robert Young is Julius Silver Professor of English and Comparative Literature at New York University. He's the author of White Mythologies, Writing History and the West, in second edition in Routledge, 1990. Colonial Design, Hybridian Culture, Theory, and Race, Routledge, 1995. And Postcolonialism and Historical Introduction, Blackwell, 2001. with Jean Kalfa, as I just mentioned. He's the co-editor of Frantz Fanon's Psychiatrical and Dramatic Writings, titled Alienation and Freedom. And should you like to know, that's Bloomsbury 2018. And it's also, as we know, it was first published in French. His book, Fanon Questions, is forthcoming. He's the editor of Interventions, the International Journal of Postcolonial Studies. They'll be speaking on the title will be Decolonizing Madness, Fanon's Tuskegee and Tuskegee Fanon. So without further ado, we have Kalfa and Young.
Thank you very much, Louis. So, when working on editing and publishing Fanon's psychiatric texts, the more I read Tosquelles, the more I could see how important his thought and practice had been to Fanon. So I was really delighted to take part in this project by writing the Fanon and Tosquelles chapter of the catalogue, in order to have access to all the texts written by Tosquelles, and also to see this wonderful exhibition, thanks to the brilliant work and the generosity of Carles Guérin and Joanna Mazo, an exhibition that I hope you will all go and see in New York now. So Fanon spent a year and a half at Saint-Alban as Tosquelles intern from April 52 to August 53, but they already shared the conception of what psychiatry was and was not. Fanon had already written a book on disalienation, Black Skin, White Masks, and an important PhD in psychiatry. In this PhD, he defended the idea of a gap between the organic and the psychiatric that Tosquelles had also forcefully asserted, as Joanna said a bit earlier. Both were equally influenced in that by Lacan. Mental illness could have and often had its cause in neurological organic disturbances, but it could not be reduced to them. Fanon had shown specifically and empirically on neurological degeneration and neurological illness that it could be sometimes accompanied by religious delirium, possession, and so on, but not necessarily so. It could take different forms. Across all the cases recorded, the illness could take a variety of exclusive forms, which meant that as a mental illness, it could not just be reduced to the common organic cause. You had to bring in social and cultural factors to understand it. So mental illness could not be derived mechanistically from a constitution, that's a term that both of them use a lot, of the self, as the majority of psychiatrists believe still. And both wrote on the inadequacy of this idea of a mental constitution. Also, like Tosquelles, Fanon was interested in, but also critical of surrealism, like Joanna has mentioned, and of the idea of the relationship between art and mental illness. He wrote on that in his PhD, but this against Lacan. He doubted that madness was an extreme form of freedom that tested the limits of reason, like the surrealists advocated. He always saw in it a pathology of freedom. So Tosquelles, probably like Fanon, saw in art in the asylum an instrument of therapy, like Joe has underlined, and from the point of view of the psychiatrist, as a way to understand the lived experience, le vécu of the patient, as Tosquelles says in his study of Gérard de Nerval. So what Saint-Alban under Tosquelles gave Fanon were two further things. First, a clinical practice in relationship to their shared understanding of psychiatry, the technique of social therapy or institutional therapy. And secondly, as Tosquelles noted much later on, a certain understanding of the rural world and of its capacity to self-organize. And both of these things are crucial if you want to understand the political outlook of Fanon during the Algerian War of Independence and the books that he then wrote. So first, a few words on social therapy. Fanon and Tosquelles wrote together 3 articles on the therapies that they used. And the model that they defended is based on the idea that personality is never fixed. There's no mental constitution that a patient that would explain the symptoms of a patient. A neurological illness can be pictured, in fact, as a sort of collapse or disorganization of the building blocks of the self, which then tries to reconstitute itself, to rebuild itself. And the various types of pathological reconstructions that we can observe, these are what we call mental illnesses. So it was first necessary to dissolve these pathological reconstructions. And for that, they started with shock therapy. So they were not shy about several times on that. They used electroshock, sleep cure, insulin coma therapy. But these were never treatments in themselves. They were first steps that had to be followed by a process of psychotherapy where personality would reconstruct itself. And this process took several forms, which implied a complete reorganization of the psychiatric institution because the patients had to interact with the institution at each moment, and the staff in the institution had to be involved in the activities that the patients organized themselves. Hence the idea of an institutional psychotherapy. The asylum needed to be cured too. So these forms of psychotherapy, there are a variety of classical psychotherapies, individual or in groups, but within a context which replicated the outside world and where patients were involved all the time. So the patients had to be re-socialized as much as possible, since personality could only develop in a relational, social, and cultural way. And for that, they worked in particular. For instance, they wrote and they printed the internal journal of the hospital, which was a very important thing for both Tosquelles and Fanon. Fanon, when he went to Blida in Algeria, then immediately created a local journal. But they also organized cultural activities, which involved them all, like outings, cultural events, film screenings, etc. Now, this complete reversal of the constitutionalism of classical psychiatry is, I think, crucial to understand also thought after Fanon, when he arrived in Blida. For instance, in L'Enceinte de la Révolution algérienne, A Dying Colonialism, which he published in 1959, and his most famous book of the earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, 1961, he presents the shock of colonization as the dissolution of the personality of a whole people. And throughout the book, he uses the psychotherapeutical vocabulary that they used in the joint articles. So those people who have undergone the shock of colonization now find themselves reified, objectified, objects of exploitation, but also objects of study by colonial ethnology. And their personality has become frozen as the colonial system imposes a spatial and a social compartmentalization, which in fact is very similar to that imposed on those committed to traditional asylums. And this system only generates or exacerbates mental and behavioral pathologies, as Eric has just described, which Fanon describes at length, which can take all sorts of forms, like criminality, violence, or sometimes also religious enthusiasm. So such behaviors are not the expression of a transhistorical indigenous personality type, a primitive constitution of the indigenous mind, said Fanon, like the colonial psychiatry argued, but in fact they are social, psychopathological structures that have been determined by historical circumstances. A lived experience proportional to the remaining capacity. He wrote using an expression that Tosquelles had also used. I just mentioned colonial psychiatry. Could we list, please? The hospital where Fanon started to work, Yes. So the hospital where Fanon started to work in the Blida Joinville Hospital in Algeria, where he arrived in November 1953, just a few months after leaving Saint-Alban at the end of his internship, had been designed by a psychiatrist called Antoine Porot. Porot was the sort of the architect of what was called the Algerian School of Psychiatry, which considered that the indigenous population was constitutionally retarded, that it was unable to assume any sense of responsibility, that it didn't have a clear consciousness of its own actions, and so on. So when he designed the hospital where Fanon arrived 20 years after it had been built, which was a modern hospital at the time, he divided it not simply between men and women, as psychiatric hospitals were built at the time. So in this plan map of the hospital that you can see, women on the left, men on the right, but he also divided it between indigenous patients and European patients, indigenous on the top, Europeans at the bottom, making sure that indigenous men were as far as possible from European women. To give you an idea of the scale of the hospital, what is the sort of alley in the middle, which is number 3, contains all the administrative and treatment offices. So it was a huge place. So what Fanon was writing about was the fact that colonial psychiatry was only projecting onto a nature, constitution of the patients, what was in fact a historical construction, the construction of a society where everybody had to be mad, as he said in his resignation letter in 1956. Now, the population, therefore, is described, I mean, the shock of colonization is described as a neurological catastrophe, which produces a pathological personality, the colonial personality. Now, within the colonial context, the popular rising that occurs in some specific historical circumstances, these are really important. In Madagascar, for instance, the circumstances were not right. But during the Cold War in Algeria, it was possible for an uprising to have a political consequence. Now, this uprising, he describes it as a shock therapy, a dislocation or a dissolution of the colonial personality. And as for the long process of psychotherapy, which takes the form of the struggle for liberation, Fanon saw in it not just a political action, but a form of social therapy, in the sense that also Tosquelles had mentioned of a therapy of the social system. The whole society is forced to become involved in this process, and each individual has to take responsibility, even at a very modest level. So Fanon saw in this process what he calls a detoxification, désintoxication from passivity and from the cult of authority that had been instilled by the colonial system. In turn, this detoxification helps, or will help, he hopes, decolonize societies to detach themselves from the cult of the leaders, which he could observe in the late 50s in societies where decolonization had only been the transfer of power from an old colonial elite to a new local one. So that's a first really important thing that Fanon gained from his stay in Saint-Alban. And briefly, the other thing that I mentioned, the importance of the rural world. Tosquelles noted in a homage that he wrote for Fanon 30 years after his death in 91, that Fanon's emphasis on the importance of peasant participation in the revolution in Algeria derived precisely from his knowledge of the rural regions around Alger, l'Algérois, says Tosquelles, as well as what he observed in Saint-Alban, where the hospital was at the center of the village, and the patients operated in a cooperative way with the agricultural community that surrounded it. And Fanon indeed spent a lot of time studying the culture of the local communities in Algeria to understand how his patients and their families understood their own mental illness, and to develop social therapeutical practices that were suited to these cultures. And he did forcefully advocate for the role of the peasantry in the Algerian Revolution, rather than the local proletariat or the petite bourgeoisie, and he was heavily criticized for that. So there's a clear influence of Saint-Alban on Fanon's thought, writing, and practice. But that doesn't mean that Fanon was exclusively Tosquelian, if this could have meant anything. In fact, he went to oppose Tosquelles on 2 points in particular, which are, to conclude, I'll summarize briefly. One is agitation, and which is a technical term that was used at the time to describe violence in psychiatric hospitals, where you had pavillons des agités, agitated walls, like in this map that you can still see. Fanon maintained that the violent behavior of some patients resulted from internment in itself, and that the reform of the asylum that they were proposing would eliminate all needs for containment of agitation. While Tosquelles said that it was wrong to think of agitation as a direct product of asylums. It was not a specific psychiatric syndrome, but it could accompany a number of different syndromes. So that was the first point. But another point which was more important derived from this divergence. For Fanon, madness itself is a form of confinement within the self, a pathology of freedom, and confining people in a mental health institution, however much it has been reformed, can only reinforce that confinement. So on this point, Fanon sided with a group of French communist psychiatrists who questioned the idea that the hospital could be made into a liberating microcosm, as they said, of the outside world. And they argued that relationships of power would necessarily be reproduced inside the Hôpital Village, the village hospital. Tosquelles responded to that, saying that in fact, it didn't make much sense to try to cure people within an outside society which had produced the illness itself. But Fanon then spent the last 2 years of his practice of psychiatry in Tunis from 57 to 59 to create and to run a day hospital where all the treatments they had developed could be administered, but where the patients would not reside. And in that, he developed psychiatry, the mental health care within a colonial context. So we received a lot from Tosquelles, but also strongly disagreed with Tosquelles. And Tosquelles, who always reiterated or repeated his respect for Fanon, I'm sure probably thought that this disagreeing, this intense vigilance, both theoretical and practical, which were so essential to Fanon. I would say that vigilance is probably the philosophical concept that Fanon had developed. I think that Tosquelles probably thought that Fanon had probably at least partly learned to criticize him with him too. And I will finish on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Robert Young.
Thank you. Thank you, Lewis. Thank you, Mathilde. If we could just show the slide, because what to talk about is the way at the exhibition in New York, right at the back, there's a little display cabinet showing some Fanon material. This is a section of it. And on the far left, as you can see, is the photograph that's already been shown multiple times of Tosquelles, who's in a suit and tie. He's sitting cross-legged in a child's playpen, lighting up a cigarette and looking down at the ground. And then to the right, juxtaposed with it, is this small, these are tiny little photographs, direct prints from the negatives. Three-quarter face photograph of Fanon taken in Tunis, impeccably dressed in suit and tie, his eyes gazing out of the photograph away from Tosquelles, perhaps symbolically, into the future, it seems. And these two very disconnected photographs that have been put together suggest in many ways the dramatic differences between the two men. The one deliberately cultivating jokes, a little madness, choosing to situate himself even physically in the space of childhood. The other trying to look as official, respectable, and as serious as it's possible for a man to look. As a white man, of course, it was easier for Dostoevsky to cultivate his own unorthodoxies and eccentricities, while as a black man in a white society, as he himself recounts, Fanon always had to prove his right to belong. His normality, his belonging, was never assured. But the differences between the two men were more complex than the stark juxtaposition suggests, I want to argue. And in order to talk about that in the time available, I just want to consider one of Tosquelles' own two memoirs of Fanon. Jean has just mentioned the second one. The first one was called simply Fanon at Saint-Ambon, which he wrote in 1975, which was 14 years after Fanon's death and 22 years after Fanon had left Saint-Ambon for Algeria. The first 1975 memoir of Fanon is cited relatively little by critics and biographers for a simple reason that Tosquelles describes himself. Despite beginning with the remark that, I quote, "For all those who met Frantz Fanon, nothing is easier than to remember him," Tosquelles' essay doesn't take us into memories of Fanon at all, but remains highly abstract throughout. And when he gets to the end, he comments, "So, in conclusion, I realize that I've said nothing, or almost nothing, about Fanon, not even about Fanon at Saint-Ambon." And then he adds very characteristically, "To tell you the truth, I'm happy with that." So most readers either laugh or scream with frustration at this point when they get to the end of that essay, having expected so much. But Tosquelles' reason for being happy that he'd said nothing about Fanon is, in fact, I think, remarkably interesting. He adds, saying nothing here means that everything that the life, the friendship, the work shared with Fanon have awakened resonances in me. So for Tosquelles, remembering Fanon, or the prompt being asked to remember Fanon for this article, which he wrote for a collection of essays on Fanon, being asked to do that and thinking of Fanon has actually ignited memories precisely of the work that they shared together and what they were trying to achieve at Saint-Ambon in the early 1950s. Aside from the clinical papers that he wrote with Tosquelles that Jean mentioned, Fanon himself left us no account of his experiences of working with Tosquelles, other than Tosquelles' two memoirs of him and Fanon's editorials in the hospital journal, Trait d'Union. There's almost no information about what he did or what he thought during the 15 or so months that he was there. The memory of Fanon prompts Tosquelles to recreate the dynamics of that precious time, not in terms of everyday incidents, but in terms, as I said, of what they are trying to achieve together, you might say their own ergotherapy. Beginning with the images beginning with an image of all those who made that tortuous journey to Saint-Ambon, which is right far away from anywhere in the middle of the French countryside, Tosquelles emphasizes that to arrive there wasn't to move to a place, but he says to be already on a journey, a trajectory of vagabondage or vagabondage, vagrancy in English, relating to psychiatry, to the poetics of cultural space, to the people of its surroundings, what became known, as we've heard, as sector psychiatry or geopsychiatry. Saint-Ambon, says Tosquelles, place of a hypothesis, which in suggesting that he puts together what he calls his hypocritical method, that is replacing the head with the feet, through which you learn from your experiences of vagrancy, with the idea of continual experimentation, of organizing the hospital according to an ongoing hypothesis. So this isn't medicine applied according to a predicted, anticipated outcome, the cure, but one that creates and enables unanticipated networks in the relation of variables within the hospital and its subjects, its patients, not through the production of new subjects as objectively good, as in standard medicine, but through what Tosquelles calls each subject's own production of themselves by means of the collective. And here we get to what Tosquelles called, we've heard already, the transfert éclaté, or burst transference, or Jean called transferential constellation, which is perhaps easier to understand. It's the constellation of the hospital that is at work. Tosquelles declares that Fanon himself, instead of learning it when he got to the hospital, he already had that method before he arrived, which is perhaps surprising. But thinking about it, we can see one aspect of it in the open ending of Black Skin, White Masks, where he closes the book not by concluding, but wishing to remain a man who always questions. That questioning was always founded on listening, allowing, as Tosquelles puts it, madness to say its word and re-elaborate itself. So Fanon, says Tosquelles, was clairvoyant and better at hearing. I'm quoting now. He didn't let himself be fooled. Some would say that he was even pathologically suspicious, even a tad paranoid. He assumed an attitude of paranoia critique, whereby the operativeness of the psychiatrist in training, the real psychiatrist, he adds, is always in training, his marginality in relation to Cartesian and rationalist culture, his distinctions and his third ear only allow him to weave a net with the products that ooze from the suffering of his patients. And in order to generate such complex psychic transversals, Tosquelles argued that it was necessary to practice what he called an avancement thérapeutique, or I don't know how to really translate that, therapeutic eviction, expulsion, the dismantling of all the forms of regulatory systems that alienate individuals in psychiatric institutions, so that the hospital becomes a place that's open inside and out. And this happened, as we know, and as we've heard, by transforming the social organization of the hospital into a shared open community. But dismantling the regulatory system wasn't simply a matter of abolishing rules and barriers, because it also extended to the embedded cultural and ideological mentalities of the doctors, nurses, and patients. So in order to be open to new and unanticipated possibilities, the inmates, all the inmates, including the doctors and the nurses, says Tosquelles, had to lose what he called their normopathy, the pathology of normality, you might say. So he used this term to name a condition in which we suffer from our own frozen mental regulatory systems, rather like those in the hospital, which we've imbibed from childhood and many other sources of authority. And the hypercritical method of therapy can't work under conditions of normopathy, the pathological condition of holding to normality. So how do you get? Well, the regular way for doctors to break out of it is through what Tosquelles calls the didactic cure, interestingly, of undergoing psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis takes us out of the enforced repressive normality that our upbringing and education has instilled in us. But Fanon, on the other hand, as we know, never underwent psychoanalysis. And though some of his colleagues, such as Alice Cherki, who subsequently became an analyst herself, have claimed that Fanon has said he would undergo analysis after the Algerian War was over, there's nothing, in my view, in his own writings at least, to suggest that he came any closer to classical psychoanalysis in his later life. Indeed, he seems to have moved further away from it. Tosquelles makes a much more interesting suggestion that Fanon didn't try to cure his normopathy through psychoanalysis because he'd already broken out of it in another way. This is Tosquelles. Rightly or wrongly, to escape the effects of normopathy, he'd invested and assumed his own verb. By what means? I don't know. Never mind. In truth, he worked and he was worked by his word. En vérité, il travaillait et il travaillait par son verbe. So what does Tosquelles mean by this intriguing suggestion that Fanon not only worked language in his speech, but he himself was also worked by it? And invoking Fanon's relation to his own language, Tosquelles emphasizes what he calls the poetic dimension of his own thought. Quote, even his lyricism was never an escape into the verbose imagination. If he flew away, it was to see better, to distance himself before landing in preparation for new, more operational actions. In other words, his imaginative flight, propelled by his poetic gift for language, always took him out of himself and away from normopathic restrictions that we can compare to the idea of allowing madness to say its word. So in presenting Fanon as someone possessed and dispossessed by the imaginative power of their own language, Tosquet transforms his earlier image of Fanon, or Fanon's body actually, as dancing feet to one of a boat, so that his subsequent life of wandering in far-off lands becomes a version of Rimbaud's Bateau Ivre, the drunken boat, and no doubt Nerval, the voyager also, propelling him on a journey in which Fanon is seen as propelled by the torments and risks of his own poetic genius. Fanon, says Tosquet, unlike certain thoughtless young adventurers before him, didn't forget the cartography that other navigators had previously drawn. This didn't prevent him, quite the contrary, from being alert and waking up to the incessant variations of the sea and the whims of the winds. This did not prevent him from seeking the unknown and a little further beyond that. But he never sought the storm to be able to prove to himself the measure or excess of his power. He didn't fear the storm if it came his way. That's all. His duty was to face it. Fanon undoubtedly loved the boat, his boat, but let's not forget it was always to go somewhere. So this risky journey of Fanon's poetic demon, his Bateau Ivre, Tosquet suggests, was itself a voyage out into Winnicott's transitional field, or a version of Winnicott's transitional field, the intermediate space between inner and outer, the stage on which the drama of all social institutional psychiatry must be performed and acted out. So in saying nothing about Fanon at Saint-Alban, Tosquet takes us instead to the very interior space of Fanon's genius, about which almost nothing is said, but remains the kernel of what makes Fanon unique, and his writing above all so arresting. Himself fascinated by the scenes of possession in Algeria that he would go out at night to watch in the mountains of Crea, dreams of possession, as he writes, every type of possession. Like Rimbaud, Fanon too was possessed, inspired and inhabited by the spell of his own language, of his own verb that propelled him into a creative, transitional space of possession and dispossession. And that was how Fanon lost his normopathy.
Bravo. Bravo.
Thank you.
Okay, so this session goes until 3 o'clock. I think the members of our audience would may have things to ask, but while they take a moment to collect their thoughts, I could just bring up something that perhaps we could kick off conversations with. The panel moved from concentration, certain themes. There are many wonderful themes in the panel, but it struck me how so many of them are speaking so profoundly to the present. I'm speaking, of course, of concentrationism, war, and germane to this session, Fanon's relationship with Tosquelles. Now, concentrationism continues in our times. We already know this in a variety of ways. And I'm curious also in the discussion of war, of whether we may consider if there's a conflation of war and conflict. In other words, are all conflicts wars? Okay? In other words, is it possible that war is a subspecies of conflict? There's also something that we may want to consider, which is as we think through Tosquelles and Fanon, whether Fanon's discussion in Pour Noir Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, discussion of sociogenesis, entails a ready convergence of the relationship between the two of them. And of course, as we just heard in the last presentation, this wonderful question of the complexity of, we could say, the de-normal pathologizing. In a way, the complexity and awkwardness of language actually plays an important role here if we think about the forms of debates that are happening in global Southern linguistics, and also some of the misunderstandings of how we even think of language itself. of course, in this session, we're dealing with it not only on the reflective level, but the subconscious and unconscious levels. So with that said, would any of you would like to add anything in light of what you listened from the others before we take it through to the audience?
For me, I think it's fine if we start with the audience, but if they have nothing to say, perhaps we can try.
Okay. Well, could someone from the audience, if they don't mind, to just click the raise your hand? Is that I don't see anything coming up yet.
One reflective thought about what you just said, Louis, while the audience gets back to us. I think it's really interesting, this idea of conflict and war, because to some extent, as I was trying to suggest in my paper, the war was so foundational to the development of institutional psychotherapy and to Fanon's work in many ways, right? So it's the kind of real conflict, but then how that gets translated in the clinical practice is very interesting, because the idea is that basically conflict is going to be necessary in all group formations, or is inevitable in group formation. So how can you kind of channel that conflict and use transference to precisely make institutions sources of healing, as opposed to kind of spiraling into the conflict, right? So I think we didn't really talk about this, but all of the practical activities that both Toscaïès and Fanon set up in their hospitals were designed not to mask conflict, but to kind of bring it out and deal with it through this notion of kind of the clinical space, as opposed perhaps to the more global space of the war. So I think there's a kind of very interesting parallel between these two things. A similar conversation about kind of the word fascism. The founding fathers of institutional psychotherapy are actually responding to the real fascism, like Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, Vichy, but then there's also the kind of the second generation that starts to talk about the fascisms in our heads. So how does these kinds of fascisms keep on inhabiting us? Right, which I think, again, links us to very much to contemporary problems.
Thanks, Camille. I was also thinking through a theme that pops up in Fanon, which is, oops, let me just make sure this doesn't keep doing this noise, which is the concept of love. And I'm thinking in terms of the reference to the family that was brought up. Which is just to give an example, if one is talking about a conflict with a spouse or one's child or one's parent, there's an investment through which the conflict can be productive. But it's rather striking, right? When you think of war, the construction of the other is fundamentally the enemy. So there's not an investment, in other words, of building a relationship, but the destruction of the, right? In other words, the eradication of even a dialectical mediation. So I was just curious about it in that sense. And it comes up, of course, because Fanon, it's interesting enough, although many people will talk about his discussion of war, there is discussion of love. And there's a subtextual discussion of the kind of investments, say, in the clinical relationship that's going on in places like Saint-Laurent or Blido-en-Ville and other places for Fanon, even in Tunisia. But I was just curious what some of the others may have to say about that as well. If I put my cards on the table, why I brought it up.
Sorry, Louis, just quickly, were you suggesting that actually this war and peace, or whatever the opposite of war is actually a misnomer for us, because it implies somehow civil society is at peace and then on occasion that society is at war, when actually it's really states of civil society in which the real antithesis is between peace or some equivalent of that and violence.
I was more in terms of whether we can broaden the concept of conflict, right? Instead of treating conflict and war as isomorphic.
Exactly, and as if somehow the only form of conflict is war within the state, was actually the state itself doesn't reserve violence for people outside the state.
Yeah.
Perhaps I could add something here, which is that the last text that Fanon wrote when he was in Algeria, in the hospital journal, which played in a way this journal role for trying to manage conflicts. So this final text was a study and a criticism of the disciplinary code for the football club. Fanon had created a football club. The patients had built the football pitch. It was extremely successful. There were competitions. And then suddenly the nurses decided that they would create a disciplinary code to try to keep the patients a bit less disruptive. Of course, they were mentally ill patients. And Fanon spent a lot of time, when it was really quite dangerous for him, to reflect on that. Just before he left, that's the time when he was writing very little and in this journal. But still, he took the time to say that there was a natural tendency, he calls that a sadistic tendency of all institutions, even those that are designed for the care and the love or the cherishing of the people who are in their care, to create violent subdivisions, categorizations, and so on, what he calls the natural sadistic tendency of institutions. So he spends a lot of time discussing about that, and what is about the space of the Zionism as a space is very interesting. Another thing I wanted to say related to what Robert has just said is that in his preface to Black Skin, White Masks, Francis Janson, who published the book, says that he asked Fanon what he meant by certain expressions. And Fanon himself says he didn't know. He was taken over by language. So what Tosquelles said later corroborated that quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jean. Actually, that's a wonderful observation, because but I'm going to go through some of the questions that just popped up. But it's an ongoing debate I've had with certain philosophers, particularly analytical philosophers, in their conceptions of language, because there's almost this conception of a prior rationality that's then moves into language. Not that the act of languaging may not have a prior intelligibility through which it's produced. But that's another debate. For now, one of the things, I'm just going to get to some because they're addressing some of you, okay? One person wrote that it's interesting that war and conflict are a natural element in keeping families together, but I think that point I made about investments and the question of the distinction between war and conflict may have we already had a conversation about that. So I'll go to the one that's first to Eric. I would love to hear, this is from a person, Grevier Isfrik. I would love to hear more about Eric mentioned that rates of mental illness decreases with the onset of war. You may have mentioned it, but what were the thoughts on the causation of that decrease? And that I'm just going to put them that way. They're in the conversation in case we run out of time. Okay. And then from Liat Ben Moshe, war, colonialism, conflict, and also concentration camps. It is so interesting how Tosquelles and Fanon interpret the hospital and its role so differently at the end through their own experience of internment. So that's not really a question, but a reflection that may connect through. Now, this one, I think it'll be interesting to hear some of your thoughts. It said the person, which is W.J.T. Mitchell, Lewis Gordon's question of the application to the present makes me wonder how the difference between colonial and civil war and the concentration camp would be applied to the crazy language around Gaza, which was already described as an open-air concentration camp before the onset of the present conflict. And let me see if there's any more. And again, reason I'm going through them is in case we run out of time. Also from Michel, also would love to hear more about relation of political and psychological of constitution. It's also an interesting phenomenological notion that talk about. And then now, can you give me a reminder about what madness is reflected in all of us and what Tuskegee felt about it? I think that's already a lot, but I think that could give us time. I just wanted to make sure that those who are participating could get their voices out there. So we could, any of you could reflect on any of those. And one went directly to Eric. So maybe we should begin with Eric, okay?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the different questions, and it can start a conversation. The first thing I should say is that the decrease of rates of psychosis during the war is Toscaeus saying that. I mean, it's not me. I mean, I haven't conducted such studies, but the argument by Toscaeus, which I find interesting, is that basically he's saying the violence of the world, at least in the context of war, it is out in the open. And that, I think, is the key to what he's saying. And that has to do with the whole discussion that we're having about normal, abnormal. Basically, we tend to assume that in a normal world, there's no such thing as war. But in fact, what Toscaeus is saying is, let's start with war to understand what is going on. So the violence is not an exception. It is something that is inscribed in social relations, except that we're not quite telling the truth about it. If I can add in a continuation in response to the question about the present, of course, in my own presentation, I did think of the present and I did make a reference, but one question is the present, which present? I have insisted on the fact that we could say, once we start talking about terrorism, that is after 2001, not that we didn't before, but it has become a central figure. Now, if we think about what's going on in Gaza in relation to what I talked about, what strikes me is that, and I can say this very much in the context of France, but not just France, there has been considerable insistence on the fact of naming the attack by Hamas as terrorism, and at the same time on calling what Israel is doing in Gaza a war. So there's a tension between the two terms, which it seems to me has something to do with what I was trying to say about the hesitation between different ways of talking about reality, which is consistent with all the discussion about when violence is in the open, when it's supposed to be an exception, when it's supposed to be the rule of the game, etc. So the tension between terrorism and war, I think, is central for understanding what is going on in the present, but it's not just the last few months. It is something that has been going on, at least, of course, and I know we could go much further back, but since 2001. I think you don't have your mic, if I may, Louis.
Thank you, Eric. You're right. Camille, would you like to add? I see that Robert is putting down some notes, so I'll give him a moment.
Perhaps, yeah, just, I'm not sure if this is addressing the question about constitution, which is very interesting because I think it works at the kind of social level and personal level, but perhaps we can link that to the question about how madness is reflected in all of us, or how Toscaeus thought about this. I think it's one of the points where Toscaeus is, or I think institutional psychotherapy is ambivalent to some extent, because there is this idea on the one hand that they want to trouble the difference between normal and pathological. So again, using Canguilhem's work, so that these notions, for example, thinking of psychosis as just another form of life rather than a kind of abnormality. But at the same time, I think all of the institutional psychotherapists really insisted on the specificity of mental illness and the fact that it was not just a kind of a product of, you know, an angry reaction against society or against your family, which is what a lot of anti-psychiatry ended up arguing. So I think both for Fanon and Tosquelles and everybody else, they were very, very insisted on the fact that that madness had something specific to it. But the problem was that, you know, the idea that that could be cured with a pill was really where things started to go wrong, because you needed to think about it in a much more kind of holistic way and think about the relationship: what is social, what is biological, what is neurological, and then try to address it on that level. So, for example, and this is very much the case for Fanon, but also for Tosquelles, they were all very much pro-medicine, even pro-electroshock, right? The medicine was only helpful as long as it wasn't used, as Jean-Henri said, as a veterinary science. So it was a way to kind of open up a new constitution of the subject, perhaps, of subjectivity, but not a way to numb the patients, but it was a complement to the psychotherapeutic interaction. If I may add just one question, I think for Jean and Robert, I was interested in your thoughts on this. Super interesting papers. But I wanted to know perhaps if you had some thoughts about why Fanon is not remembered perhaps in the genealogy of institutional psychotherapy as remembered as some of the other thinkers are. This was something that I sort of wrestled when I was writing my book. And I don't know if it's because Fanon perhaps didn't attend, you know, the Journée de Saint-Alban and the kind of like institutional events that consolidated this tradition, if there is one, or if you think it's just racism, or if you think, or they just diverged at some point. Like, how do you explain or perhaps he also died too early for that to talk to psychiatrists. The name Fanon was not the first one that came. It was much more Tosquelles, Guattari, à la limite.
John, do you want to kick off?
Well, I think Fanon was quite peripheral geographically. I'll say, I mean, he didn't get involved for very long in Saint-Alban. So, and that's one reason. But the other reason is that he became enormously famous for his political writings and anti-colonial writing, and in a way that eclipsed everything else that he had done. There are several other reasons also, like for instance, his brother insisted on the fact that his PhD was not a serious PhD, that he had done it very quickly, which was wrong, and things like that. So in a way, he was a bit marginal in the movement, even though people like Henriet, the great psychiatrist of the time, considered him as a pioneering and very interesting, and said so.
I think, I mean, he wasn't known for two reasons. One is that certainly his later papers, they were all published in like North African journals and so forth, that probably regular psychiatrists in France weren't reading. So they were France is publishing in, and so that was important. But he was also part of that general sort of erasure of France's history with Algeria and the war, which really only sort of started to ebb away around 2000, around the turn of the century, where people somehow, for whatever reason, began to feel, you know, people started writing about Algeria and so forth. But for a long time there was a sort of silence about it. But also Fanon's reputation was not good. So in the 1990s, one of my graduate students was in Lyon, so I asked her if she could go to the university to try and get a copy of Fanon's thesis, which she duly did. And when she went there, she got a lecture from the department saying he was a very bad man, they refused to give it to her on the grounds of him being a traitor and so forth. And then somebody in the room contacted her afterwards and kind of slipped her a copy and said they claimed it was lost actually, and then he said actually it's not lost. Here's a copy. so you know, there's a sort of bad aura of Fanon, and my guess would be that psychiatrists didn't want to pick that up, and it's interesting that even people, you know, Guattari and people like that who might have done didn't, but I have no idea why.
There's something that struck me also, because as we know, you know, when sur la désalination Denois was rejected, he submitted something on Friedreich's ataxia, and it struck me that to have the case studies and the data, he must have been along. You know, as we know, Fanon was a trick, and there are so many stories, particularly from Joby, of things he was doing. So clearly, even though the lore is that he wrote it in 2 weeks, you know, the alternative, it's clear he was working on that for quite some time. And so I just thought maybe that's one thing that I'm curious what you'd say about that. But the other thing I think comes through from Eric's discussion, and actually each of you in a very interesting way. You know, the conversation we just had on conflict and war, it struck me, if we go from an existential analysis, that there's also around the notion of normality. In other words, we tend to use the metaphor of being or stasis, ontological metaphors, on normality. Yet at the same time, the notion of human existence, of course, is a diversion from being, existence, which raises a rather interesting question of the relationship of with the insight in the notion of normopathy, of the idea of the very project, say, of not being mad. But I was curious if those two things are on the table. The first one is more scholarly. But the second one is more an open, just thinking out loud, theoretical reflection. And I'll look into the chat.
Well, perhaps I could say on the first one that it's obvious that he spent a lot of time working on that, and that it's a very interesting PhD with references to Lacan. He was one of the first readers of Lacan at this level, in any case. You have to be careful with what his brother Joby says. I met him and I could verify that. The other thing I wanted to say is perhaps there's a link between this idea of question on normality, on conflict and madness. If I remember well, in an interview, Tosquelles says something like, during the war, people are no longer divided. They are on one side or on the other. So the ones who need treatment are the psychiatrists because they don't have any clients or patients anymore. So this idea that everybody is mad is in fact linked to the idea of a structural permanent division of each individual, which doesn't occur when they are fighting against each other, because now they are each on one side and only one side.
I think just in relation to what Jean just said, you know, Fanon liked to dramatize things, or we like to dramatize Fanon, I think perhaps is also accurate. So you often see accounts of the thesis and people, you know, biographers and things say, oh, it was immediately rejected, or it was, you know, summarily rejected, as if somehow he proposed it, he put it in, and it was just thrown back in his face. But actually, you know, it was university, so it went to his supervisor who wrote a report, and then it went to the docent at the university. You know, there's a whole committee process that before finally it was turned down as being unsuitable or a bit dangerous, potentially. So Fanon would have probably, you know, would have gone on for months. So he had plenty of time knowing that it was a bit iffy, so to speak, or its chances were not good, to just thrown in his face, and then he had 2 weeks to write another one. It was a much longer process. I wanted just to link up something that we've been saying in terms of this whole thing about war. It's very interesting that Tosquelles says, war had its advantage, as Camille was saying, because madness can be out in the open there, and people are not psychotic, or the symptoms of madness in the civil society sense are not so apparent. But that's completely the opposite of what Fanon writes in his resignation letter to the in 1957 or 56, 57, where he says, in a society at war, a psychiatrist can't do anything. So I wondered what anybody thought about that. They seem to, in that sense, have a very different attitude towards war, but it seems to go against what Tosquelles was saying. Maybe it's colonial war is different from the Spanish Civil War. I don't know, but Fanon certainly didn't seem to feel that war was helpful, because people, didn't find it so difficult psychologically as they find normality.
Perhaps it's the colonial situation which is very different, because when in the end he speaks of struggle as detoxification.
Mm-hmm.
When the struggle happens, when people take sides, and then the process of disalienation occurs within this context. But the experience of the colonial situation is not exactly a war. It's more the interiorization of the conflict.
Yeah.
Yes, and
I'm sorry.
it's
Go ahead.
more than more. Yeah, in his case. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, I was saying go ahead.
No, just that the problem with the Algerian war was that it wasn't fought like a war. It was about abduction and torture.
Yes, in fact, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Camille.
No, please. I always think of the passage on violence in Fanon as a kind of electroshock, also. Like in the kind of parallel situation, like sort of like that the conflict is necessary, but then what comes after is what's more important, the moment of repair, like the being there and the kind of rebuilding. So I think in that sense, you could see it as a positive, as a kind of shaking up, and then, but obviously in both, I think for both Fanon and Tosquelles, we're very aware of the array of mental illnesses brought about by war also. I mean, that Tosquelles talks about that in the camp, this whole thing that I talked about, the camp psychosis, but obviously, and Fanon was hyper aware of that too. Louis, go ahead.
What I was thinking about is something also that Drusilla Cornell and others have talked about, which is the concept of an atmosphere of violence, and how that relates to, because his analysis of colonial conditions, okay, that ultimately there's this, which I think relates to some of the earlier points about that point at which there's something there, but there's a certain point where it's now more out in the open. So there's a paradoxical kind of open secret, so to speak. It is there, but it's denied that it is there. But given the time, actually, because I didn't want to get into something where it might be nice if we reverse the order. So each of you could make a remark that way. That should bring us right to the 3 o'clock point. Okay, so that would be from Robert to Jean to Eric to Camille. Okay, so Robert.
I was just reading. There are quite a few other questions in the chat at this point. I'm wondering whether we should.
Sure.
One of them I certainly couldn't answer myself, which is about institutional psychiatry in this country, which I think tomorrow's panel with Edward and people will be better able to respond to.
There's one I could read out because it's in a Q&A part,
Mm-hmm.
and that still, I think, could enable us to have a brief, close. Addressing the nebulous boundaries of conflict, placed in quotation marks, could we speak to the shift of civil commitment in the U.S. criminal? That is, it is my understanding, the questionnaire, that part of what fostered the dismantling of the mental health care systems here especially in the 1980s, stemmed from court cases where individuals who had been committed by family or others were released from the institution for reasons that, quote, they did not pose harm to themselves or others, unquote. Based on my interviews, this is from Jennifer Stutz, based on my interviews with psychiatrists and psychotherapists, it was this ruling that altered how mental illness was defined from a legal standpoint, such that those who would benefit from care often ended up in the criminal justice system. Will any of the speakers or any of the panelists be able to address legal issues that directly impact current civil commitment in any country with which they are familiar? Okay, and that one is a biggie for 4 minutes, but if somebody would like to at least make a remark on it.
So there's a message from Liat and Edward saying they'll address it in the next panel.
Okay, good. So,
Excellent answer, Robert.
excellent. So pay attention to the next panel. So we have 4 minutes. I guess that would give about a minute each. So why don't we go with each of you?
Well, I'd just like to get back actually to the questions from Tom Mitchell in the chat, which I think actually it's interesting that our discussion, and of course Eric's paper in particular, is brought up with the language of war and peace, both in public discourse and in psychiatry, and the ways in which these two interleave, and actually how it's psychiatry that is perhaps uniquely positioned to talk about that, because it's psychiatry that can see the degree to which conflict makes up all forms of life, and what is set up as a sort of distinct separation in the way that we think in our normopathic thinking is really not the case. So we need to really rethink that in the language that we use and the words that we use to describe actions.
Thank you, Robert. Jean?
Yeah, perhaps I would continue on that line, which is a line of vigilance, being awake to one's own misunderstandings, etc. If we reread The Red Shade of the Earth from the point of view of Tosquelles, in a way, or from the point of view of psychiatry and psychotherapy, it's really striking to see how much the book is more a warning about the risks and the inability that we have to anticipate those risks through processes of liberation. And I think that's really one of the major lessons that Fanon gives us, which derives from his psychiatric practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Okay, Eric?
Yes, perhaps briefly on the question raised by W.J.T. Mitchell. Indeed, terms used, tribe, reality, are very much criminalized. Not only is using the word genocide exposing people in France at the moment to being called anti-Semitic, but more precisely, the word resistance has been banned, and the argument of resistance has been banned by the Minister of Justice, and there are people who are called, summoned to the courts for that reason. And which leads to a point about Tosquelles. I mean, the point is really how we name things, that is, how we make sense of what is going on. And that's the advantage, so to speak, of war for Tosquelles, that at least it names things. And I want to just conclude with this. We tend to see Tosquelles more as a psychiatrist, and we tend to think more of Fanon as someone who's talking about politics. And we may forget the political side of Tosquelles, and we may forget the psychiatric side of Fanon. In fact, if we look at what Tosquelles is saying, he's saying, on the one hand, madmen are not so mad. They're pretty normal. So let's not think that they're others, that we're so radically different from them. So that's the psychiatric side. But there's also the political side. That is, he's saying, yes, because we're mad. And so he says something not just about people who are in asylums. He's saying something about all of us and about how society works. And so that is, in my opinion, the link between the psychiatric side and the political side, which is not an opposition between Fanon and Tosquelles, but which is something that they have in common.
Thank you, Eric. Camille?
Yes, I think we're out of time, but just to reiterate what everybody has said, and another way I think to put what Eric was saying is to, I think both Tosquelles and Fanon urge us to think about the role of the social and the political in the formation of the individual unconscious, but also the way in which we need the unconscious to understand the formations that are political. And I think this is certainly something that links us back to the present, and the use of psychoanalytic notions and psychiatric notions to understand, things from war to identifications with authoritarian leaders to conflicts to all kinds of phenomena that we're living with. So, and I look forward to the next panel where we'll get some of answers to some of the questions that we posed here. So thank you again, Louis, for moderating this.
It was my pleasure, honor, and privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for this wonderfully Sankofic moment, by which it means to look at the essential elements we need to understand the past to move forward. So thank you much.
Thank you,
so
Louis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lewis, for this wonderful way to bring everyone together, and also for everyone's presentation. It was illuminating program and discussion, and how it connects to our present. We will continue exploring the figure of Tosquelles and how it relates to us with our second panel. It's called From Desalienating to Decarcerating Mental Illness in the United States, and we'll have a 30 minutes break, and we reconvene at 3:30. Thank you again all, and see you online.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.